My name is Ron Creed. I was born in Birmingham in 1928. My early life was at school. Things were tough in the 1930s. Jobs were hard to get and money was in short supply. Of course, you have to realise that during this period there was no NHS, and if you went to or had to go to the doctors, you had to pay to see a doctor. And of course, during this period also, there was no welfare. If your parents didn't work and earn money, you had to go without. Life was very tough. Sometimes it was difficult before the end of the week when my mother got paid to produce a meal, and so we went a little bit short until it was payday. Illnesses that you had which you thought were minor could be quite major, and because of the fact that you had to pay then before 1948 was rather serious and something to have to sit and think about. But once the NHS came in, all those worries, so there was major worries were removed from your mind.
And what was that like for you and your family?
Well, it was a major deal for my family. I was young, and luckily I was quite healthy at that time, so it wasn't so concerning for me as it was for my parents and grandparents, especially my grandparents, who suffered a lot of hardship, and they were in their 70s, so they required a doctor and healthcare more than anybody else. So that was a big load off their minds when the NHS came into being.
If we can now move on, I know that you were 11 in 1939 when war
Yes.
broke out, and I know that you remember the broadcast in September. So take me back to that time and as an 11-year-old sitting, listening to the radio.
Well, as a family, we heard, as most families had, that there was to be an important announcement. I believe it, as far as I can remember, was on a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. And the Prime Minister, which was then Neville Chamberlain, said that we were now at war with Germany. As an 11-year-old, of course, it was difficult to analyse what was going to happen. The only thing that did concern us more than anything else was that we were being told that we would be bombed from the air by enemy aircraft, and that's what led to evacuating all the children from the big cities.
And tell me about that experience for you, Ron. Tell me what that was like when you knew that you were going to be evacuated.
Yes, we my parents told me that all the children were going to be sent into the country because of the fact that we could be bombed. And we arrived at school one day with a case with some clothes in. We were assembled in the hall, and we had a label tied to our jackets, which gave our name and address. And we were told that we were taken down to the nearest railway station, and that we were going to be put on a train and sent out into the country so that not be concerned about air attacks. And that was quite quite destroying, really, in the mind, because if you can recall, at 11 years old or even younger, you are going to be taken from your parents and taken somewhere you've never been before. Psychologically, that was quite important to you. We arrived in Hereford, and we were taken to the school hall there. Didn't know who was going to pick you and what they would be like until you were actually taken to their homes. It's something that is imprinted on your mind that you never forget. In my case, unfortunately, I was with another boy from Birmingham, and we were with a not very good family, and the children of that family, who was slightly older than us, looked down upon us and gave us quite a hard time, especially the fact that our parents weren't there to guide us or help us. So it was quite a traumatic time, really.
And it was so traumatic, you didn't stay with them for very long. So tell me what happened, Ron.
Yeah, well, I stayed with this family for 3 months, up until the Christmas of 1939. And things became quite intolerable to the point where you just wanted to leave the family and not come back. As in my case, my mother decided, because there was no aerial bombing in the city, she decided to take me back home during the Christmas of 1939. And things were just quite normal at home, like they've always been. The only thing is, because of the evacuation and because the teachers had to go with the children to teach them, there was no schools in the city at all during the year of 1940 and 41.
Yes, and you missed school for 2 years. So tell me what effect that had on you.
It had a lasting effect on my life, because when you're young and you're being taught, you're taught a lot of basic things, just small things that you kind of miss out, because when I did go back to school, instead of starting from the age of 11, I started from the age of almost 13, you see. During the time, there was no schooling. Most of the time was taken up during the daytime by sleeping, because at night we were continuously under air attack from 6 o'clock in the evening approximately during the winter till 8 o'clock in the morning. So you spent most of the daytime trying to catch up with sleep.
Tell me a little bit more about those 2 years of being constantly under attack.
We were supplied during 1939 with what is known as Anderson air raid shelter, and the size of the shelter was almost unbelievable. If there was 4 people, the size of the shelter was no more than 6 foot by 6 foot. There was just enough room for 4 people to sit in there. During the nights of the air attacks, you had to go out there and sit in the shelter with a blanket around you, because it was obviously in the winter, it was so cold, and the condensation from your breathing during the hours you were in used to form as droplets of water on the iron inside, so that the walls of the shelter were constantly running with condensation from your breath. It was extremely cold. At the same time, there were periods when you forgot about this because the bombing was so intense and the explosions were so intense that you were more concerned basically of whether you were going to live or die. It was as bad as that. I suppose the worst time I remember was the week. There was a week when you probably heard that they bombed Coventry to the ground, but all the aircraft that came over flew over the city of Birmingham as well and bombed Birmingham as well as at the same time as they bombed Coventry. When you heard these bombs coming down, you heard the whistle from the bomb, and you never really knew whether one of them was for you. Well, the emotion I felt at the time was we were living in a horrible world, and I couldn't imagine life if it was going to be like this year after year. Because as a young boy, you didn't take in the fact that the war was going on somewhere else, which would eventually alter things. So, as a child, you thought that if this was life each and every night, life was pretty horrible. We had two very close calls, which were not far from the house, where the whole road was completely obliterated with quite a loss of life. But you just had to take it on the chin, I'm afraid. It was the fact of life at that particular time. You had an inner-built kind of strength that came over you when you, bear in mind, you'd spent the whole winters while all this was going on, and you kind of got an inbuilt discipline from it all.
And when you think back about those times, especially those first couple of years of the war, what are your thoughts now, Ron?
My thoughts at the moment are, as you know, we're going through this COVID-19 virus, and it is basically similar conditions, except that it's a silent enemy that we're facing now, and we don't know who and where it is, and consequently, I think we need some kind of inner discipline to carry out the things that the government have told us to keep ourselves safe, and that's all they did during the war. They brought out all these things to try and keep the general public safe, and that's what they're trying to do now. About 1942, a lot of children had come back from evacuation, and consequently they'd opened the schools in the cities, so we actually started school again. I found it was very important to get back to school. Even as a child, I enjoyed the fact that I was back at school and doing something positive.
And what was that like, being back at school, being with your friends, being with the teachers?
Well, yes, to be with children of your own age at that, bear in mind you'd spent almost 2 years without being in close contact with children of your own age. That was very important. And the very fact that you hadn't used your brain for a couple of years. I suppose most as a boy you miss the friendship of other lads that that you with day to day.
And have you thought about, again, the parallels with today's young people, today's children missing out on school because of COVID? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, my mind went back to the 2 years that I didn't do any schooling, and I realised that it's so important the period you're at school, because it only occurs once in your life. You only have one chance at it, and I think that it's more important for children to go to school than the actual virus itself.
How would you sum up those war years in terms of your experience, your emotions, and what you went through?
To me, I've never forgotten it. They were very traumatic, of the events that went on, and it was not just the bombing in the night. That was bad enough, but you also had to live, and during the daytime you had to try and get supplies of food and goods. Bear in mind, we did not have supermarkets then. Each store that you went to sold individual types of food. So as a child during the daytime as well, I remember always standing in queues, going from one shop to another. My grandma would be in one queue, I would be in another queue, and it took 2 or 3 hours in queues just to get enough food so that you could live a normal life. And this has always been in my mind, the fact that you had to queue everywhere, as well as suffer the war and the indignation of it all. So life was very traumatic at that time. And certain things like the farmers used to supply rabbits to the city, and there used to be long queues just to buy rabbits, for instance. And also, whereas you had a ration book for meat, I know this sounds a bit gross now, but the offal that was inside of the meat, inside of the animal, was not on ration, and you could buy pieces of offal to increase your food supply that you needed, especially people, you remember, your parents, well, not only during the bombing at night, they had to go to work during the day. So they were virtually, sleep had to be snatched wherever he could.
And you left school in 1944 at 15, and then you went to college, and you got an HNC, and you qualified as an engineer. And at 18,
Yeah.
well, you went into national service.
I was 18 in 1946, and I had my calling up papers, called up to do national service, which everybody did. But if you wanted to continue your trade or profession, then you wanted to carry on with it, you had to sign on for a number of years. In my case, to carry on doing engineering in the forces, I had to sign on for a minimum of 8 years.
I know that you went to a camp in Blackpool to do some additional training in engineering. Just tell me what it was like for you, because obviously it was post-war. You know, as a boy, teenager, you'd had quite a number of hard years coming through those war years. What was it like at the weekends for you and your mates in Blackpool? What did you get up to?
Well, they used, because being Blackpool and during the holiday season in the summertime, you probably all heard of the ballroom, the wonderful ballroom in Blackpool Tower.
Yeah.
And we used to go there and meet up with some girls and go dancing like normal young people would. And we had a really good time. It was very kind of basic, but nevertheless, and we didn't have too much money in those days. So, but life was pretty good. It was a huge change from during the war years.
And also, you started to spread your wings because you were posted to Aden, Yemen, when you finished your training. So tell me about going to a completely different culture, away from home for the first time, and you were still very young.
Yes, I was 19 then by that time. It was a massive change from just living in Britain in a kind of what I would call a secluded way in this country to being suddenly taken to another part of the world. The change in culture was quite vast. People live in a very poor state. There was no education for the children out there. There was very little in the way of hospitals or medical help. So we helped them where we could. We helped them. I remember local people in Aden that used to work for us during the day because it was an extremely hot country and we weren't used to the temperatures there, and so we had help from the local people, and we had food. We gave them some food supplies to help out because they were in a very bad way in their own homes. I think of what's going on in the Yemen now, what a terrible thing it is. The fact that they're bombing and shooting one another.
And the work you did in Yemen, I know it was quite rudimentary. The camps, you were responsible for generating the electricity, Ron. Tell me how you went about that. And
well, the camp the main camp where we were posted to in Aden was quite a big, substantial airfield. But in those days, there were no jet aircraft. They were piston propeller driven. Consequently, they could only fly for a certain amount of time before they wanted refueling. So there was lots of small airfields dotted about up the coast of Arabia and in the eastern coast of East Africa. So these small airfields had to be maintained by the RAF, whereby there would be just enough ground control people to actually maintain and run the airfield and refuel and service the aircraft that landed there. And I was posted to 3 of them, one after the other. I did about 9 or 10 months on each one. And not only did we have to service the aircraft and the transport, I found out that I even had to generate our own electricity. And this was done by 3 diesel engines with generators on, which had to generate electricity 24/7, basically to keep all the aircraft controls running, and also for the telecommunications, which in those days was only Morse code. Every message and every communication had to go by Morse code. After doing 2.5 years in the Middle East, Aden and the Middle East, I came back to to Britain for a short break of about 9 months, and then I was posted out to Malaya, Singapore. In Malaya and Singapore, it's completely different. It's tropical. During the period I was there was a war going on in Malaya between the communists and the British troops there. There was also a Korean War going on at the same time, of which we had to transport British soldiers who had been wounded in Korea, only came back to Singapore for hospitalisation away from the war zones. So that was quite a traumatic period with two wars going on at the same time.
Ron, we're going to wrap up, but before we do, can I just ask you a couple of questions about COVID, if that's all right?
Yeah.
And tell me how you've been coping personally then from lockdown in March to the present day.
Well, of course, the worst period was when we was on total lockdown. That was the hardest time. So I live on my own, and I'm in a house which I run myself completely, day to day. And the only good thing that something strange happened. It might sound strange to you, but I had two sections of fencing in my garden blow down at Christmas, and that allowed me to sit outside and talk to the lady next door who sat outside our house, and we were able to have a conversation day to day. So that helped during the complete lockdown, and that was truly mainly a coincidence, as I said, that the fence blew down and I hadn't renewed it, that allowed us to do that.
And what did that mean to you?
Well, with the strongest will in the world, when you're completely on your own and you only have telephone calls, you're not allowed to, during that period, you weren't allowed to meet anyone and physically talk to them, can have quite a mental effect on your mind over a long period. So, as I said, the fact that I was able to talk to the lady next door, she lives on her own as well, but we're able to talk to one another without being, we were 12 foot apart. Was quite significant.
What things have you missed the most?
I suppose it's the fact that you're not allowed to mix too freely with people. Although recently I have obviously been able to have visits from my daughter, and the fact that I'm able to come up here for 2 or 3 weeks is very significant to my day-to-day outlook, and I can understand people that are completely locked away, if you like, during this pandemic and not allowed to have people to visit them.
And when we touched on it during the interview, Ron, but the parallels to what you went through as a child and a young man to today. Tell me about your thoughts about the parallels, about what you went through when you were younger and COVID today.
The parallels are the fact that today we've got an invisible enemy, which we don't know where it is, when we're going to meet up with it, whether we're going to come in contact with us. And the difference between that and the same parallels during the beginning of the war was the fact that we did know who the enemy was, and we were warned it was coming. And yes, it could do the same damage as the this disease. So there are similarities between the two. I think knowing the unknown is quite scary with the virus. It is completely unknown to us where it is and where we could pick it up. So I think today's parallel is quite distinct. The main thing is that we don't have to sit in air raid shelters all night being bombed. So that's a completely different scenario, if you know what I mean.
And a positive.
And positive. But the two things are quite similar, believe it or not. Although we've got national health today, and we've got welfare, and we've got all these things that make life a little bit easier, which in the war years we didn't have any of these to back us up. We were more or less on our own, if you know what I mean, individually.
And my very last question, Ron, how has it been for you to be interviewed today?
Well, you're very good at asking the questions.
And has it been a good experience for you to talk about your memories?
Yes, it has in a way, because it's I've spoken about a lot of things which I've thought about for a long while, and I don't know whether it'll help anyone else to understand what it was like. I think that can be something for the good of people to try and understand of what had happened years ago. And when you get into your 90s, which I am, you start to think about the whole of your life and what kind of a basic life you've had, whether it's been good, bad, or indifferent, And so it's nice to, if you can put into some kind of context, to help people today know basically how we suffered during the war years and compare it to today's suffering.